Hi, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with Yorke Rhodes. Yorke is the Director of Digital Transformation, Blockchain and Cloud Supply Chain at Microsoft. In this discussion, we talk about the path that led him to blockchain and how he co-founded blockchain at Microsoft. We also talk about his work using blockchain in supply chains and digital identity and how NFTs have now crossed the chasm. Yorke is also on the board for the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition and an Adjunct Professor of Digital and Ecommerce Marketing at New York University. So he brings a great depth of perspective and knowledge to the discussion. Yorke, it's awesome to have you here.
Yeah, great to be here. Too bad we couldn't be in person.
Yeah, absolutely right. So what I wanted to start with was kind of what pulled you into blockchain in the first place and learn a bit more about that, especially because you're one of the people who really got the blockchain, made blockchain a thing within Microsoft as one of the co-founders of the initiatives there. So I'd love to hear more about how that came to be and your journey around that.
Sure. So I've been on a pretty much innovation journeys throughout my career. So always on the bleeding edge of various technologies, actually going all the way back to when I started in computers in the first place. I basically started making these sort of decisions about what I would do and what I didn't want to do. And the first one was after I took my first computer science class in college. Was on a mainframe, and I was like, I'm not doing that again. And I was very fortunate to be at the cusp and the beginning of the IBM PC and the Apple era. So basically decided that I was going to spend all my time on PCs because they were very accessible and open, and it was sort of a standard, if you want to call it that. And so that's what I've been sort of doing throughout my career. Yeah. It's like just looking at the next wave of technology. And I was pretty deliberately, I would say, in the late 2010s, for the next couple of years, looking at what were the emerging trending technologies going on. Obviously, e-commerce and everything about e-commerce was quite big by then. And mobile, which is where I was working, was quite big. So it was always looking at what's on the cutting edge of what we should be thinking about from a technical perspective that's relevant to brands and consumers, and that will be transformative. And so I was quite fortunate to be doing regular listening and research, and basically coming across my social feeds in early 2015 were all these weird computer science terms that we know, love, and well, in the blockchain space. But sort of intrigued me why I'm hearing about all of these very technical protocol-y terms that I heard, dealt with in college. And that kind of woke me up that, eventually I realized that this was because of blockchain, right? The distributed technology we're dealing with. And from there, convinced myself, over a period of study that this was a transformative technology that had many different types of applications, and in particular could have massive, what I would call, sort of humanitarian or consumer or constituent centric value propositions around the world, depending on, the particular plight or thrive of a particular consumer or constituent. And so I happened to then also in 2015 be introduced to my co-founder, Marley Gray, who was on a similar journey, very specifically looking at the financial services applications of blockchain technology. And so I was in a partner team. So we basically split up the work where I was, took on all the partner work. And he continued to focus on, his client base essentially, and that was really the beginning of our journey. Very informally formed, with relatively new leadership under Satya Nadella. Really with an empowering statement from the beginning of his journey about having a growth mindset, about what we think we should do as employees, and really embrace that quite hard. And so that started our sort of, as I said, informal journey that became more and more crystallized over time. Now we're very fortunate to be working early on with Consensus in 2015, and sort of trying to figure out what could we do together that was sort of productizable or meaningful. And this was, when we sort of fell into, well, logically, where the market is, it needs developer tools, and we want to encourage more developers to come in. And so, this is when we basically started working on the Visual Studio plugin for Solidity, along with Consensus and Juan Blanco and others, to sort of get a Microsoft stamp, so to speak, on that capability, bring it into the developer audience of Visual Studio. And this is actually before VS Code, right? Before Visual Studio Code. So fairly early in that journey as well. But we were able to essentially ship that plugin in March of 2016. So like very early in our journey, we had, something that we put into the market, right? As a statement, as a tool, without yet a proper engineering team. Right, we're still very early in the journey. So,
and at that point, being so early on, as you said, there was kind of this innovation remit, that was coming from the top of the company under Satner's leadership. But at the same time, it must have been challenging to get people on board, with this kind of thing that's happening, like this decentralized world. And how did those conversations go too? Because you can't.
Well, I think I'm grounded, having been on many innovation journeys. I'm very grounded by what an innovation journey is and what that means for any technology, regardless of what it is, right? Including blockchain and decentralized technologies. And so, on a journey like that, at least my perspective on what does this mean, right, for the next N years in terms of what I will do at Microsoft, it was recognizing that the ecosystem in which I was playing was a Microsoft ecosystem, right? And that in an innovation journey, whether I was running an external startup or an internal startup, basically the proxy for the external, consumer adoption and believers was the Microsoft community, right? The Microsoft executives. And so that grounded me, knowing that like 95% of the conversations were going to be not very positive, right? And that literally is any innovation journey, right? It's like you have a small percentage of believers and a high percentage of disbelievers. Is my video still running for you, by the way?
Yeah, it's all good. I'll let you know if there's any problems, and obviously we'll get this section cut out as well.
Great, thank you.
Cool. So with so in those early days, I mean, the focus there was on kind of really empowering developers and to build on it, which I guess is slightly reflective of where blockchain was in 2016. In that, you had the Ethereum was there, but it was kind of even before that point where you'd had that maybe the ICO mania started bubbling up, that sort of year and subsequently. But in terms of the recognition and acknowledgement of where the good use cases were and so on, there's certainly, prior to that, there was, well-known things around like, elimination of reconciliations and things like settlements and, various other ones. But do you at that point in your experience, was there kind of some clear applications that you were really excited about, or is it kind of, it's been gradual over the last few years, you've really started to see these are the killer things that are really going to work well, which obviously is reflected in the recent successes and there.
So I identified really, I think from my perspective, two areas that were obvious for this type of technology early on. One was consumer identity. And how that could have an impact in the humanitarian space. Excuse me. And the other was, what does a supply chain look like, and how do supply chains touch the developing world, and therefore what could we do from a decentralized technology perspective to enhance the, what's going on, not just from an enterprise perspective, but also from a contractor and a worker perspective in the very far upstream of the supply chain. And so those two areas really were, in fact, I wrote about both of those in 2016, 2017, because I think they were quite obvious, right, for this technical approach. And that really began the journey of Microsoft's work, along with others in the identity team, to understand that there's something remarkable about using a distributed public key infrastructure that's not owned by any institution or individual to actually be a root of trust. Microsoft Identity Team, which is an entire engineering team that's focused on all of our identity products, right, including Active Directory and authorization services and Windows Hello and everything that you see from a Microsoft multi-factor sign-on capability exists within the context of the identity engineering group. And so, that's where basically the identity work was landed and really stewarded within that group, through product release cycles.
And going a bit deeper on the identity piece, I mean, that's something that this year as well, there's been some big announcements coming from Microsoft about too, and the whole decentralized identity initiative. And so Active Directory being like such a foundational layer in so many organizations as well when it comes to identifying all the different parts of the business as well as the individuals working within it. Where do you kind of see where we are right now versus where we need to get to? Because of course there's this notion of being able to remove these centralized platforms, but it's something that's going to take time. But also you need kind of the right organisations there who are providing like the claims verification and providing the trust element of these credentials that get issued to blockchains and so on.
Yep. So, the work both in blockchain as well as in identity started out in Microsoft as, incubations, basically explorations within an engineering group about the technology, understanding it, what could be things that are relevant to Microsoft to do. In the identity space, I think it was probably even harder than it was in the blockchain space to understand where Microsoft had a role to play. And then also, there's always a pressure at some point for revenue. So like the question always is like, why are we doing this, right? Is this a strategic initiative? Is this a standards initiative? How is this going to generate revenue on a product basis? Or is this just something that, is a game changer and we need to do it? And I think what the realization in the identity team was that it was pretty effectively a game changer, right? You're basically flipping authentication and authorization right on its head. And when you do that, and this is really the revelation, is that you unwind a whole bunch of very complicated spaghetti federations that you don't need, right? If you put the identity trust in the hands of the consumer, and then have essentially claims of what that consumer is allowed to do. And so it's a fascinating area, and Microsoft Identity Team basically looked at that and said, well, does that help our core problem set around authorization? The answer was yes. And does it do things that are remarkably different and better, right, from that perspective? And yes was the answer. And so then you started to look at, well, okay, to your point, Active Directory is about in 80% of institutions, government, private sector, not-for-profit, commercial entities alike. And that becomes a huge lever of a vehicle, essentially a ship vehicle for capabilities or features or whatever you want to call it, where now we could take our newfound belief and start to, fuse it onto a ship vehicle. And so what's actually launched now, through a couple of years of announcements and incubations, is an ability for a customer to flip a switch on Active Directory, which allows them to issue DIDs to their employees, and then verifiable claims that say this is an employee, right? And this employee is active and has an authorization to do things within the context of Active Directory, which is your sort of your enterprise or your institutional permissioning system. And so that's where we are, and the foundational way that was laid down from a blockchain perspective was through the work we've done in the Decentralized Identity Foundation with all the different organizations, small and large, working on this type of identity and verification systems is to say, well, we need to, if we're going to actually issue a DID and verifiable claims, we need a way to do that, and we need a way to do it at scale. And so that's where the ION project emerged out of, is like, how do we provide essentially a layer 2 buffer for identity, registration, and lookup. And ION's sort of counterpart is called Element. One is a specific version for the decentralized Bitcoin blockchain. The other is a version for the decentralized Ethereum blockchain. It's not necessarily personally the way I would have actually shipped the product. I probably would have done it more with a single code base with options, whereas these are two separate code bases entirely. That may change over time also. And then I think to the last point is that layer 2, like any other layer 2 technology, has to be run right by essentially validators, right? And so that journey is really, I would say, quite nascent. Getting people to run those layer 2 nodes, but everything is there from a technical perspective to actually do to realize the vision of delivering, registering, creating DIDs at scale with verifiable claims, leveraging the Active Directory asset as a way to really, to sort of push the market into this space.
And in terms of for organizations as well, this notion of having these identities linked to blockchains that have these, well, being decentralized in their nature, and so you don't have those same single points of failure. And granted, there are various kind of failover patterns and so on in enterprise architectures that help kind of address some of this, but then there's something incredibly powerful though about that sort of that resilient, unstoppable sort of infrastructure powering this.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the challenges that the internet has today, it's basically challenges associated with centralized services. It might, and they might be slightly decentralized, right? It might be 3 providers or 5 providers, but those types of services, to your point, like you build up massive fortresses to protect them. Because they are vulnerable points, right, of capability. DNS falls into this category as an example, among other, types of constrained service provider environments. And so, like if you take this to the most logical sort of end state, and you look at, like, besides the example I just used, which could be, you could bring down the internet by attacking a small number of parties, right? Essentially, that overcoming that is obviously critical. And then secondly, if you take it to an even further end state, which is now I've been issued credentials by my government, and my government becomes overthrown, right? And potentially a very bad regime comes into power and can start to abuse the credentials and information that they have about people for many horrific humanitarian nightmares. And so that's where these things sort of come together, right? This is obviously a scaled up technology, but it's also a scaled up humanitarian problem around the world. And so I think obviously we're a long way from adoption, particularly on the second part of that. But I think with the tools are in place, and so it's I'm very bullish for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's well, with you talking as well about the humanitarian angle as well. So something that you're very involved in and are on the board of is the Blockchain First Social Impact Coalition, and that's been going for a number of years. And what is it that kind of pulled you in there? Because it's obviously something that you care a lot about.
Yeah. So I mean, the key thing that I was looking for was a place really to sort of consolidate my efforts around blockchain in the humanitarian space. And so this was a vehicle to do that. And it emerged as it was incubated inside of Consensus. And once it actually emerged out of Consensus, then it became a place where I could be a board member. And so that was sort of I was already working quite closely with them and really enjoyed the work that they were doing. And so I was supporting that. And so becoming a board member there was logical from that perspective. And then secondly, it gave me a very good place to just consolidate my efforts around, blockchain in the humanitarian sector. And the organization has focused on, things. We did on Earth Day last year. We had already actually gone remote, from an event perspective. So we were well set up and planned to hold a remote Earth Day event. This is early in the pandemic. Earth Day is in April, so that was a huge success. It's on our YouTube channel. All of the content that we delivered there, and effectively we run incubators, coach startups, connect the various communities in the humanitarian space around, different types of initiatives with, the hardcore blockchain developer community, to really, create new interesting patterns and, help companies get founded and things like that. So it's really bringing together, two communities is one of the, sort of the primary successes of the organization. It takes a lot of work. It's basically 100% volunteer at this point. And so, we rely heavily on our volunteers and their interests really to drive what the organization wants to do and focus on. So if we looked at actually one of this year's focus, not surprisingly, is what's going on in the NFT space and DeFi space. Last year we did a lot around climate and Earth Day. So,
yeah. And the especially, I think this is one of the other things that often people don't talk so much about is how big an opportunity DeFi presents as well for some of those nations where there are significant numbers of unbanked, or just they have local currencies and so on that are subject to things like hyperinflation because of the regime that comes in, and the kind of how it levels the playing field for these people. In that, yes, there's regulation that needs to be put in place around DeFi, but there's also the equitable access it provides too. In that, if someone wants to get a return on their, I don't know, whether it's like a USDC stable coin, for instance, if they've got $100 worth of it or $100,000, they still get the same return. It's not like the existing financial markets where there's kind of there's people don't have that global access to the same offers, and economies of scale serve people quite differently.
Yeah, I think generally the crypto asset space and the payment space around crypto assets is it's a hard to navigate space because you're dealing with different financial regulations in different states in the United States, for example, and then at the federal government level, different financial regulations at the European Union, right, and across different parts of the world. And by definition, the underlying technology of crypto is a global phenomenon, and I think the closer that regulators get to understanding that and the value of that, actually, I think the better, obviously. And that's sort of I think the work that a lot of people are doing in the crypto and the DeFi space is really trying to help educate. And we've seen good examples of that. I mean, in the United States, the pipeline hack, right, which resulted in a cryptocurrency traceability case study, right, by the FBI, is a great example of it's not a black market, right? You can actually follow the transactions appropriately and then use tactics to coerce people who hold the private keys to actually give them up. That's a good thing, right? That means that the government is realizing, right, that they can track what's going on this financial rail, and I think to your point, people have been looking at various methods of financial inclusion for many years because of the potential humanitarian value propositions, and I think the combination of, to your point, DeFi and stablecoins in emerging markets is a very powerful combination, along with an economic transactional history, right, for folks, whether they're smallhold farmers or other types of local economy transactors. this all will provide significant value to those constituents, and give them ways to have stable value independent of potentially massive local currency fluctuations, which it's not necessarily a great statement for central bankers, but in some cases it's a reality. But also to your point, like look into various earning protocols, right, around savings, earnings, whatever you want to call it, loan protocols around that value is extremely important for those markets. One of the early examples that I talked about in my blockchain journey in the humanitarian space was about smallhold farmers and how smallhold farmers, and particularly in this case corn, could benefit from an economic history and the potential loans associated with that economic history to acquire equipment that would let them actually be more efficient with their crops, right? Therefore get more value for their crops, therefore improve their economic situation.
Yeah, and certainly, especially when you talk about these more remote regions, there's things as well that are kind of crossing over and coming from with big initiatives like Microsoft's push to net zero, for instance, and the being able the whole offsetting carbon markets and creating these technologies, making use of IoT and blockchain to actually provide more accurate measurements of where these initiatives are happening. Because often it is in these more remote or smaller communities. You might be planting, whether it's trees or reducing the amount of emissions they're doing through more efficient cookers. There's so much happening into these other applications there as well of the technology.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. Like there's so many areas of remote emerging economies, local regions that a large enterprise touches, whether it's in because of the supply chain, right? In the fashion industry, it's going down to cotton, right, and other raw materials. In the high tech industry, it's going down to the raw materials that make up silicon chips, right? And so the question then becomes, take it as a classic example, problem set in the high-tech community is the origin of cobalt, right? About 20% of the origin of cobalt comes from what are identified as conflict sources. This means that they're coming from mines, which oddly enough are called artisanal mines, which sounds like a cottage industry, but it's not. Which is like essentially smallhold miners, right, who are mining without appropriate tooling, protection, and et cetera, and then not getting the value right out of the goods that they're mining in the ground, not doing anything to protect the local environment, which is creating havoc in those regions. And then how does a responsible company that is very involved in responsible mineral sourcing, like Microsoft, actually incentivize change in that market?
Yeah.
Right. And what can a global infrastructure of payment technology actually do to allow a large enterprise to affect change, right, in remote regions of the world, right? And so I can clearly see that obviously there's an incentive change needed in the local artisanal mining regions of the world, right, to get children back into school and out of the mines, right? That's just an incentive problem. But how can we do that at scale from large enterprise corporate headquarters, right? That today for Microsoft, right, largely exists in Redmond, Washington. And a technology like this that is globally accessible with all types of payment and savings and earnings mechanisms makes it quite easy, assuming you have minimal technical capability in region. For example, a mobile device that can hold those things, right, a wallet and applications, to actually impact change, right, in that market. This is very different than like how you think about what's been going on for the last N number of decades in the humanitarian sectors, right, where you have to, and you still have to have today, local NGOs who work on the ground, right, who work with the smallhold farmers or the smallhold miners or what have you, to help educate them about what's possible and what change could happen and the tooling that would allow that to happen, but the ability to then to actually facilitate the scale of that through a globally accessible technology that has globally accessible assets, right, and protocols associated with it. It's a remarkable difference to where we've been before, and even just a classic example is why did M-Pesa have such success in the region where it existed, but didn't have success anywhere else in the world, right? And so that's a scale problem, and it tells you that one, you're dealing with a single provider problem, and two, you're dealing with a local government problem, right? And so if you move those things out of the way, you've effectively got global incentive rails, right? You can then leverage.
No, it is an amazing thing in terms of that anyone really anywhere, they just need a computer and internet access, and they can create something that can have so much impact there.
Yeah, or in a lot of cases just mobile, right? People are operating off of primarily off of mobile in most regions of the world.
Absolutely. So moving on to supply chains, because this is an area obviously that you're passionate about, and it's been a big year as well for Microsoft in that respect, because the company, and this was obviously something you were very involved in, won the top award for supply chain breakthrough of the year, as well as the subcategory for process or technology innovation of the year, and that was from Gartner, I believe.
Yes.
So
so that's an unexpected and remarkable milestone, right, in the blockchain journey, right? To have the top award, in a category, it's supply chain, obviously, but to have the top award going to this technology, which is still very much on an innovation curve, and I think it's really about how the technology was applied, what's the thinking behind what we've done, how are we looking at it from a global scale perspective, and what's the impact of the organization doing the work, right? And so if you sort of summarize all those things, the Microsoft cloud business is a $60 billion a year revenue stream. It's a very large business for Microsoft, one of its largest. And what we've done with it, the reason for the blockchain award was because we took blockchain, looked at the multi-company collaboration problem, thought about the mining problems and the incentives that we were just talking about at the in the cobalt mines, and thought about the end-to-end opportunity of creating genealogy for essentially silicon-based products, right, or any kind of high-tech products, and then figured out how can we actually step through that, right? How can we start to impact change in that category? And so we selected, and this is our high-value commodity supply chain, and high-value commodities in the high-tech space are things like CPUs, GPUs, SSD, DRAM, hard drives, right? All of the expensive electronic components that go into a consumer device like a Surface, or that go into a rack in a data center, right? And so it makes up a very high percentage of the value that runs our cloud, right, in terms of those products. It's a relatively constrained, I don't want to say constrained, it's a relatively finite market. There's not that many providers in CPU, GPU, hard drive, right, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can quickly get to a high percentage of penetration in that market, which then drives other interesting opportunities. So for Microsoft, we chose a journey. We focused on a specific set of inventory, SSD and DRAM. The inventory represents about 50% of the rack value, or the cost of a rack. So it is a very impactful place to start. And it involved a set of 9 suppliers in our commodity supply chain, including SSD and DRAM providers, manufacturers, as well as our warehouse/hub provider, as well as a set of systems integrators. And most of those are actually represented in the first blog that I wrote on the topic. And so we've been on this journey for the first conversation was February 2018.
Yeah.
And so it's been a while on the journey, but in terms of like implementation, we are in production since last fall on some percentage of the SSD and DRAM volume that flows through from our manufacturers through the hub into our data centers. And we are now basically iterating on that journey for the next phase to bring on the rest of the high value commodity supply chain. And also to layer in financial controls in our supply chain. That's basically the next 12 plus months of this particular journey. And so we have great partners on board that are quoted, in the blog, Lenovo, Arrow, SK Hynix, CT Systems, Micron, and others. I think from a what's happening, what's the impact of it, how have we thought through it, what's the technical approach, all those things sort of went into, okay, well, clearly this is something that could win the innovation award in a category, and we didn't, we felt like our chances were at least 50-50 in that category. And there's an interesting, a sort of what I would call a collaborative judging process where, Gartner weighs in, a set of industry judges weigh in, and then a set of Gartner quote unquote community members, which are, all the paying subscribers of Gartner, weigh in. And so, from a validation perspective, that there's something there, right, for an innovative technology like blockchain, it's really crossing through, a number of different communities that I think is a really important milestone for, blockchain in any industry, including supply chain.
And also, just one of the details there too is that it was in 2.5 years from inception to actually being in production and serving the nine providers. That in itself is impressive, given that the historical complexity of getting these larger organizations to talk to one another. Going from a prototype to production within one organization typically can be looking at a multi-year time horizon in some cases, and so to actually achieve that degree of coordination around them is a very impressive feat as well.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, you're taking nine large enterprises on an IT transformation journey, not just one, right? And so that is a huge coordination problem, and requires weekly calls with each supplier partner that we work with to go through test and development cycles on every sprint feature upgrade, right? And so our partners have been on this journey with us, and everyone has worked really hard to achieve this. It's not just Microsoft, right? It is 9 parties working hard together to achieve this. And some of the folks in this particular supply chain have done other great work in blockchain. Like Lenovo has done quite a bit of work in blockchain. And others as well. And so, it's also sort of speaks to, the technology is beyond the proof of concept stage. People are actually doing things with it. And this is a great milestone to highlight that point. And, we're incredibly grateful to our partners for being on this journey with us. And, from my personal perspective, I'm incredibly grateful to the leaders in the cloud organization. Again, it's a $60 billion revenue line, to have belief in what we were doing and belief in me to be able to achieve it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge. So moving on to one of the other areas that has exploded this year, but been around for a couple of years, NFTs. And where do you see? Well, are you excited by them? What are kind of the areas that you see them having good potential?
Yeah. So I mean, NFTs are just such a great example of a technology crossing the chasm into the realm of zeitgeist, consumer mindshare moments. Different types of consumers, right? Consumers being creators and artists and musicians, to global brands, right? That are creating new assets for interesting assets for campaigns and other reasons, to collectors and speculators, right? And if you look at all of those, right, the ones that are the most risk averse are the brands, right? Because the brands are always scared about their reputation, right?
Yeah.
And what anything they do how it could impact their reputation. And so the fact that we've gotten so far in such a short period of time with this NFT phenomenon is a crossing the chasm moment, right? And almost all of the people that I just spoke about are not doing the type of due diligence that you and I understand is necessary from a protocol perspective, coming from the protocol space. But brands generally are doing a better job of that because they have the reputational aspect, right? So they're thinking hard about what is an NFT, right? What does that mean? What does it mean for my books? What does it mean for my consumer and customer? How does that impact me from a carbon footprint perspective? How do I communicate that in a way that makes sense? Am I giving the true promise of NFTs to a consumer when I'm telling them I'm giving them an NFT, right? And that's how, certainly for a Microsoft brand, we've been approaching it. So I have to assume that, other large brands, with similar size are probably approaching it with very similar lens. So because that's all on the positive side, right? Like it is the, and interestingly, by the way, I've been teaching about blockchain and NFTs and supply chain in my e-commerce class that I teach at NYU. It's a grad program specifically on e-commerce. And I've been teaching about blockchain and have often gotten flack about why am I teaching about blockchain in my e-commerce class. And I'm not teaching about protocols, right? I'm teaching about interesting things like NFTs and impact and how you use the technology. And this is such a great example, right? Like NFTs represent essentially the future of e-commerce, right? From a digital asset perspective, for sure. So I think that's to me is fascinating. Now on the blockchain engineer, decentralization, euphoric protocol geeks, a lot of people sort of view these crossing the chasm moments as dumbing down the technology or dumbing down the audience, right, of who's using the technology. It's inevitable, right? It's happened in every technical revolution that's been out there, including the internet itself. Protocol engineers need to keep doing what they're doing, right, and not worry about what the consumers are doing with the technology so much.
Yeah, this goes back to that whole saying that people don't care about how things work; they care that they work.
Right. Exactly, and a great example of that is there's a great speaker who talks about the Steve Jobs approach to sort of the consumer value proposition. It's really exactly what you just said, which is start with why, right? People don't care what you did; they care why you did it, right?
Also, it's I think that insight is alone, of this crossing the chasm moment where brands are actually looking at NFTs. I think that's such a crucial insight. That something that I don't think people are talking about as much as they should be, because that has really enabled this technology to kind of move into an entirely different domain. That I think a year ago, yes, people would have appreciated that this was possible, but they didn't think it would have had so much impact just 12 months later.
Yeah, I mean, the value proposition there is huge, right? You cannot ask for a better motivator than brands, seeing the value proposition of the awareness campaigns that NFTs are driving, and that's sort of just scratching the surface, right? There's a lot of marketing people who are like just fascinated. Like, I want to do that NFT thing because it created a moment, right? And I'm like, that's awesome, but you could also do this, you could do that, you could do this, right? It's a programmable asset, right? There's so many things you could do with it that you're not thinking about. The world is endless if you have the right brands involved, and that's it's a particularly interesting lever in large brands, right? Whether it's a brand in the music space or entertainment space, or a brand in the high tech space like Microsoft or Apple or others.
Yeah, it'll be amazing to see kind of what happens in the future as the space grows, because I'm sure there's going to be so many more innovations that we just don't see coming.
Well, it'll also drive the back end, right? Like NFTs represent not only crossing the chasm, but a scale problem, right? To this technology. And so any large brand that gets engaged is going to have to understand what the scale problem is that they're going to create, right? By just, doing what they're doing. And so, that then drives what they do from a technical approach perspective, which then drives the market to provide the services necessary to that technical approach. And this is one of the most amazing things about NFTs is an NFT is not really doesn't meet the promise of what an NFT is if it's not registered in a public blockchain that's decentralized enough, right? And so, I think there's pretty wide recognition that one of those foundational technologies is Ethereum. That's decentralized enough and therefore meets the promise, right? And it's where 90% of the NFT work is being done, right? Anyway, and so that's both a risk for brands as well as a risk for consumers and protocol engineers, right? Because if you go back to the statement I made earlier, which is consumers purchasing goods are not looking at the underlying protocol. They're just, you never do that, right? It doesn't happen generally when you buy things off the shelf, right? Which is what an NFT represents in the digital sphere. And so not knowing if it's really meeting the promise of what's on the label, it's an NFT, right? Does it really meet the promise of what an NFT is supposed to be? Is it an open ecosystem? Do you really own it? Who are the central parties controlling it? Is it really decentralized such that there isn't a central party, right? Those are all not questions that a consumer is asking. And that actually creates a risk to the underlying protocols, right? Because how do you communicate that message, right? And frankly, it's an opportunity for a lot of organizations to enter the market that have not achieved the decentralization that Ethereum has achieved. And say they are registering NFTs, but maybe not, meeting the promise in the way that Ethereum meets the promise.
Yeah, and hopefully it will continue to stay that way, and there will be that recognition of the importance of staying true to that openness that we need to have there.
Yeah.
Oh, Yorke, it's been absolutely fantastic to talk today. If people want to find you, I know that you're very active on Twitter and LinkedIn. Are they the best ways to reach out to you, or just follow what you're up to, or are there other ways?
So those would be the best ways. I've been toying with the idea of a reading list because I do a lot of reading. But right now, Twitter and LinkedIn and YouTube are places where you'll find, content, and things that I'm interested in. And so that's the best place. I mean, there are a number of Microsoft blogs that I've written, but they don't get the coverage that you get on social media. So it's great speaking, Conor. Thank you for hosting us.
Yeah, awesome. See you soon.
Thanks.